The unity of the biblical text has sadly been scrutinized with the advent of modern biblical scholarship. Thankfully, your methodology includes noticing literary constructs, chiastic structures, and intertextuality littered throughout the biblical texts, which heavily undermine the assertions made by biblical critics. Can you please share your favorite example of intertextuality that showcases the fact that a seemingly disjointed biblical text is in fact a brilliant literary device that serves to induce meaning and interpretation to the verses and not the work of multiple authors?
Okay, sure, I can. It'll be a bit of a journey. What I'm going to do with you here is take you through at least the beginning paces, enough to give you a sense of I think, a marvelous whole. The entire, the larger version of this you'll find in Aleph Beta. And when I say this, and all by way of introduction, and for those who are interested in pursuing it further, I will give you two addresses to look at in Aleph Beta that'll kind of help you. When you're talking about those who question the Bible's divinity, one of the most serious challenges to come our way over the last 200 years has come from the school of biblical criticism, the documentary hypothesis, which was started by Julius Wellhausen in Germany about 175 years ago or something like that. What Wellhausen noticed is that there were various seemingly various difficulties in the Torah, particularly the cradle of biblical criticism, where he really began his theory, was with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, which is the fact that as you go through the beginning chapters in Genesis, you find that there seems to be not just one Genesis story, but two Genesis stories. And what Wellhausen also notices that the names of God were different in story number 1 and story number 2. God is always referred to as Elohim in story number 1, and he's referred to as Yud-Kei Vav-Kei in addition to Elohim in story number 2. And the solution to this problem, why would there be two accounts of creation? And the problem, of course, is larger than why are there just two accounts of creation, is that the accounts of creation are not a facsimile of one another, but they're very, very different. If you read story number 1, it's different than story number 2. And so it seems like you have two conflicting stories of creation. So Wellhausen looks at this and says, well, there's two conflicting stories of creation. There's different names for God in story number 1. There's different names for God in story number 2. He proposes that there was more than one author to the text. There was what he calls an E author, and there's a J author. There's an author that likes to name God Elohim. There's another author that likes to name God Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Maybe there's a redactor who tries to smooth over the differences and put the two together and try to create some sort of unified text. But the redactor wasn't very clever and left a lot of footprints or a lot of fingerprints, such that if we're clever enough, right, we can distinguish what's the handiwork of the E author, what's the handiwork of the J author, and generally speaking, the handiwork of the E author is Genesis 1, the handiwork of the J author is these other things. And then throughout the Torah, these authors kind of continue. Maybe there's a new author in Leviticus, and there's this redactor who tries to get this all together. And thus basically is the beginning of biblical criticism. In Aleph Beta, you'll see a couple series that don't directly address biblical criticism, but have strong implications for biblical criticism, as you say. Stories that actually go back to these series that go back to these stories in Genesis. So, and to understand what's happening in those series and what we're going to do today, just by way of introduction, I would say, okay, so imagine you were you were a believer in God, and you have this guy on the plane next to you who says, hey, are you an Orthodox Jew? I'm studying Bible. I'm in McGill University. I've learned all about biblical criticism, the E author and the J author. What do you think? It seems to me that, he says, I always grew up believing in Sunday school that the Bible is written by God, but, here I've got this really compelling theory. What do you have to say about it? And you're stuck next to this person and talking to them on the plane, and you got to come up with an answer. What would you say to this guy who asked you this question? So what approach would you take in sort of dealing or understanding biblical criticism? So one approach you could take is you could say, well, you've pointed out some difficulties. You've pointed out a contradiction seemingly between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. You pointed out 3 contradictions between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, 4 contradictions. But what I can show you is that these contradictions weren't novel. Within our tradition, we had people who noticed these contradictions too. I can show you a Rashi that deals with contradiction number 1. I could show you a Sforno that deals with contradiction number 2. And I can show you a Midrash that deals with contradiction number 3. We are aware of these contradictions. They're nothing new. That's one kind of approach in combating biblical criticism, but it's not, I would suggest, a terribly satisfying one. The reason why it's not terribly satisfying is because you can say, all right, well, it's because, to put it simply, it's because the best that you're doing is playing defense against biblical criticism. If you do that, you're not playing offense, right? And the defense that you're playing isn't particularly compelling. Why? It's not compelling because of Occam's razor. Occam's razor basically says that all things being equal, the simplest explanation wins, right? So what's the simplest explanation? Here comes this guy and finds 15 contradictions between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Is the simplest explanation that, well, there was one author for Genesis 1 and one author for Genesis 2, and there were just these 2 different accounts of creation, and that's just the way it is? Or is the simplest explanation that, well, the Sforno explains what contradiction number 1 is going on, and Rashi explains contradiction number 2, and I have 15 different possible explanations of these different things? That feels like an ad hoc answer. It feels very complicated, right? All things being equal, I prefer the simpler explanation. You have one explanation for 15 problems. Your one explanation is there were different authors. That's a very simple explanation. On the other hand, the competing explanation is 15 different explanations for each of these things. That's too complex for me. Occam's razor says biblical criticism wins. And this really is the conundrum that we faced in battling biblical criticism. What do you do, right? And it's true that you can find folks that raise these issues. You can find sources that talk about this, but you're just playing defense at best, not really a compelling defense. What would it look like to play offense against biblical criticism? What would it even look like? How would you go on offense against biblical criticism? Let me suggest a path. The path, and by the way, I just want to say, to be clear about one thing. When I found what I'm about to show you, I didn't find it because I was trying to combat biblical criticism, right? It wasn't like I was thinking, gee, what can I do to save all these souls? And, I've got to be clever and come up with something. It's got to be something I can come up with. And then, the Lord God gave me this. That wasn't the way it worked, right? I just happened to notice something. But what I noticed, I realized had implications for biblical criticism. So I'm sort of reverse engineering it for you. So it's not really that, you're going on offense because you're not coming up with something to go on offense. But I still think it's a fair analogy, just to imagine what it would look like to go on offense against what the game plan would look like. And then what I want to show you is that without even trying to come up with that game plan, just closely reading biblical text, that game plan just falls in our lap, right? What is the game plan? If you think about basically what biblical criticism is doing, what the documentary hypothesis is doing, what they're doing is they're taking what appears to be a unified text, and telling you that the text is not unified, telling you the text is fragmented, right? That once you start reading carefully, you see that Genesis 1 is actually a fragment, and Genesis 2 is a different fragment, and there's all these different, you can take the text and divide it and say, this is one author, this is one piece, and this is another piece.
It's interwoven. That's what they're saying. It's interwoven.
They're not even saying it's interwoven. They're saying it's
together,
fragmented.
stitched together. No,
it's stitched together haphazardly. In other words, there's no fundamental unity, right? The notion of true unity in the text is something which is essentially what biblical criticism opposes. It says this is not really a unified text. Forget even who wrote it. It's not a unified text. There was one author who wrote this. There was another author who wrote that, right? And that the text is fundamentally fragmented. The way to go on offense against biblical criticism is to show that the reverse is true. To take the seams, right? You say, this is this author, and this author knows nothing about that author, and that author knows nothing about this author, and they were thrown together by a redactor who left the fingerprints of this author and that author not knowing anything about each other. If I could show you that that's not true, if I could show you that these two texts that you think emerged separately without having anything to do with each other are in fact deeply interwoven, that they depend upon each other, that they are aware of each other, that they're literally two sides of the same coin, that you can't even imagine one without the other. If I can show you that from within the text, then I basically destroyed the premise of biblical criticism, right? The question is, can you do that? So in a larger sense, all of Aleph Beta does that, right? That is what we do. To such an extent that, even before Aleph Beta was around, I remember when I was just starting to uncover this kind of stuff. So I gave these classes at Johns Hopkins University as part of the liberal arts program, adult education. It wasn't a Jewish thing. I was just teaching as a professor in Johns Hopkins, and in Baltimore when I used to live there. And I remember there was a guy in the back of the room after 16 sessions of this who raised his hand. And I realized that Johns Hopkins is not a religious place, right? It's a secular university. So I'm doing biblical text as a Bible class in Johns Hopkins. I'm not coming as an Orthodox, and I was an Orthodox Jew. I was wearing a yarmulke, but I'm not coming to preach. You know what I mean? So I didn't walk in there telling everybody God wrote this and all of that. I said, look, whatever you believe about this text, we can read it together. We can read it closely. We can learn from this. It's a classic of Western literature. So let's dive in and learn. I assiduously avoided any question of authorship. I wasn't getting involved in that. Didn't want to get myself in hot water. And then the last class, there's this guy, Jerry, who raises his hand. He's a professor actually himself in the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And he says, Rabbi, do you mind if I ask a question? So I said, sure. He said, so Jerry says, my whole life I'd grown up with biblical criticism, with the documentary hypothesis, with the notion that there were all these fragmented authors of the 5 books of Moses, and that Deuteronomy was found and put together, and it was all, one kind of mushkabobble. And there were all these different fragments in the text. He says, but, I don't see how that could be true, because what we've seen of these last 16 classes is that everything is so interwoven. I mean, you can't look at numbers without understanding Genesis, and there's so many, it's just like this interconnected web. I don't see how these texts could be separated. They just aren't. And he says, do you have an explanation for that? Because it just doesn't seem to work with the way I always understood it. So I said, I didn't even pay him to say that, right? He had arrived at that without any preaching, or just by seeing that the interconnected nature of the text, to the extent that the texts can be shown on their own, prima facie, on their own face, to be interwoven with one another. And how are and again, it goes back to that same methodology. And if I could show you, right, what we talked about before, Tardema, right? So Tardema is one thing. If I can show you one connection between texts. Okay, so that's one connection between them. I mean, imagine you thought that the beginning of the Joseph story, right, is written by a different author than the middle of the Joseph story, right? That you might imagine that the Judah author had some sort of agenda and it added this kind of text and did their own thing, and then it's a conglomeration of two things coming from two different places. But if I can show you, right, fundamental unity underneath the seams of the story, that's very deep, it becomes harder and harder to believe that there's two authors. Or I'll give you a better example of this. If you read the Anchor Bible, Robert Alter talks about this example, by the way, in his book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, if I'm not mistaken, right? So interestingly, one of the classic examples of Robert Alter's work there is in Genesis 38, in the story of Yehuda and Tamar, which interestingly was the first piece before I saw Robert Alter that I'd really worked on also way back in the early 90s, and seen things in Yehuda and Tamar which are very similar to Alter's conclusions. But I think even Alter makes the point in that book that if you look in the Anchor Bible and you read their commentary on Genesis 38, it's a classic example of biblical criticism. What do you have? You have a Joseph story, which basically takes up the lion's share of the second half of the book of Genesis. And then right in the middle of the Joseph story, you have a single chapter that seems to interrupt the Joseph story for no good reason, to introduce our friend Judah, and it's the story of Judah and Tamar. It's as if the Joseph story didn't happen. It's like right at the climax of the Joseph story, Joseph gets thrown in a pit, everything's in disarray, the house of Jacob is completely up for grabs. All of a sudden, let's take a commercial break and talk about Judah. One day, Judah just happened to be walking with 3 kids, and there was this prostitute, and there's Tamar, hangs out, there's this goat. And then, when you're done with that, it's like, and now back to our hero, and Joseph is taken down to Egypt. So you can imagine what the biblical critics say. It's like, sure, there were these 2 authors, there was another author, there was a Judah author who wanted to make sure that the Judah story got some play, so a redactor came and took this fragment that had been off somewhere about Judah, written by some other author, and just inserted it here, but hoped we wouldn't notice that it doesn't really fit with the rest of the text. And again, there's these fragmented texts. So how would I combat that? If I could show you that, what if I showed you that there was language in Genesis 38 that was subtly playing off the language of Genesis 37 in the Joseph story? Well, that would be interesting, right? Because that shows like there's this strand that connects the stories. But you just might say that's a coincidence, right? That was, if I say, when Judah is shown his staff and a signet ring and the stuff that by Tamar, so her language is Hakerna. Do you recognize these things? Well, that was the exact same language that the brothers, led by Judah, said to their own father about Joseph's coat, Hakerna, right? So if I can show you that, that's a pretty significant, connection. Mm-hmm. And then you say, well, maybe that's a coincidence. So I say, really? Hakerna only appears twice in the entire 5 books of Moses. Those are the only 2 times it appears in these back-to-back chapters. That was really a coincidence, right? So you say, well, I don't know, maybe that was like sort of a coincidence, maybe, right? But what if I began to show you that, so Joseph, so he loses his coat that's taken from him, and that coat turns into false evidence. And then in the Judah story, he's also got this stuff that he loses his coat and there's other things, and that also turns into evidence, right? Except it's true evidence, right? And now what about in Genesis 39 in the story of Potiphar, where Joseph again just happens to lose his coat, which turns into evidence, false evidence that could be used against him. 3 stories back to back with people losing their coats, right, that could be used for evidence against them, and you're telling me that the middle one is just, is willy-nilly, is not connected. So you can, and what if I can show you 15 strands that connect these stories, not one or two, but 15. At a certain point in time, you've just played offense against biblical criticism, right? There's no way you can come and saying, this is the Judah author. I've shown you too many things that are under the surface connections between these stories. And again, if you look on Aleph Beta, we have a course in Yud and Tamar, part of a larger Joseph series, where I kind of go through this. And then what you find in the end is that, why did the Bible do this? The Bible actually didn't do this to disprove biblical criticism. It wasn't like God said, one day there'll be people who will doubt the authorship of the Bible, so I better put these links between these different stories, right? That's not what's going on. What's going on is that those links are interpretive. It goes back to the first thing I was telling you. It's so that you can take story A and overlay it on story B and begin to see story B in light of story A. What's really happening in the story of Judah and Tamar is that you can't understand the story of Judah and Tamar without it being overlaid on the story of the sale of Joseph, right? If you think about the larger picture of it, I mean, if I would ask you this, Judah is the one who engineers the sale of Joseph, right? So think about the consequences to his own father of what it is that he did with the sale of Joseph. What are the consequences? What did Jacob lose as a result of the sale of Joseph? What would you say? What's the most obvious thing he loses?
His favorite son.
Well, his obvious thing he loses his favorite son.
And he loses his other son, who's a leader, supposed to be the leader of the family, and he loses that. He loses
Judah. He loses his son, his Joseph. So who is Joseph to him? Joseph is the Bechor, is the oldest son of Rachel, right? Of his favorite wife. So that's who he loses. But it's not the only person he loses. Think about the deck of cards, right? The consequences, the unintended consequences. Who else does he lose over the course of the story of the sale of Joseph? If the sale of Joseph continued, who else, without a resolution, who else would he have lost? Remember what happens when the brothers show up finally at Joseph's door, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him, and Joseph's really mad, right? And so Joseph accuses them of being spies and sends them home to go fetch Benjamin. But instead of just sending them home to fetch Benjamin, he makes sure they're going to come back by imprisoning one of them, by imprisoning Shimon. Right? So he's not just going to lose. So Jacob's not just going to end up losing Joseph. He's going to end up losing Shimon too, right? So he's going to end up losing two children. By the way, you ever wonder why Shimon? Why did Joseph end up imprisoning Shimon?
Because of what he did to Shechem. He was
maybe because of what he did to Shechem, or maybe because of what he did to Joseph. Remember, right before Joseph imprisons Shimon, the text tells us about a conversation that Joseph's able to overhear that the brothers are having in Hebrew. But since Joseph understands, unbeknownst to them, the brothers don't know that he understands. And in that story, Reuven starts talking to the other brothers, and Reuven starts telling them, "Hello, amarti lachem al techato b'yelad. I told you not to do this." If you're Joseph, what did you just understand from that story? You just understood that Reuven was on your side.
Correct. He was an ally.
Reuven, who is the oldest brother, right, the one most responsible maybe for what's going on, go ahead in prison. Joseph realizes was on his side. Who's the next brother?
Shimon,
right? And by the right. So perhaps Yosef starts to see Shimon as this architect of what's going on. And by the way, interestingly enough, do you remember how Shimon got his name? Right? Shama Hashem ki snua anochi, Leah had said. God heard that I was hated. Remember how Reuven got his name? Ra Hashem banyi, Leah has said. God has seen my pain and suffering. They're both named for these senses. Reuven says that when Reuven says, "Alo amarti lachem al techato b'yelad," I told you not to sin against. He says that the reason why this terrible thing has come upon us, that we're being turned away and that we have to go back and that somebody's going to be in prison. The reason why this has happened is because when Joseph was in the pit, Asher ra'inu tsarat nafsho, we saw his pain. Bitchanano elenu. when he was crying out to us, velo shamanu, and we didn't hear, right? We didn't listen. We saw, but didn't listen. Saw, but didn't listen. Who's the seeing brother?
Reuven.
Reuven, the one named for seeing. Ra'ah Shambanyi. Shimon, the one named for hearing. As if the Reuven guy was like, he was like, we shouldn't do this, right? We should. But the Shimon guy, the hearing guy, he was the one who was standing. So Yosef sees this and imprisons the hearing guy, right? He goes and imprisons Shimon, and that's the next thing that happens. So if I'd say, what does Jacob lose as a result of Judah's actions? He loses Joseph, and in a chain reaction, he loses Shimon, but he's not just going to lose Shimon. Who else is he going to lose?
Benjamin.
It goes all the way. Who else is he going to lose? Remember what happens. Joseph wants Benjamin, right? So what's going to happen? Benjamin comes back, and then Joseph frames Benjamin.
Right.
And he's going to end up taking Benjamin. And if Joseph never reveals himself, how many children is Jacob going to lose?
3.
He's going to lose 3. He's going to lose Joseph.
Reuven, Shimon, Benjamin. Yosef, Shimon, Benjamin.
That's right. And that's right. So he'll end up losing all three of these children. And there is a certain irony, though, because in the end, it's Jacob's will. It ends up being the sending of Benjamin to Yosef that in the end makes the whole plot of Joseph fall apart, and ultimately Joseph reveals himself once he sees Binyamin, right? So there's a certain irony here, because here's Jacob, who doesn't want to send Binyamin because he's so afraid of what might happen to Binyamin. But what he doesn't realize is if he just sends Binyamin, he doesn't realize something, which is that the high Egyptian official is being so mean to everybody isn't really a high Egyptian official. That person is really in disguise. That person is actually none other than Joseph. And if you just send Binyamin and there's a reunification there, what will end up happening is not only will Binyamin come back, but Shimon will come back, and even Yosef will come back, who you thought was kind of dead, right? And also there's this weird kind of dead thing, right? Because Joseph, is he dead or is he not dead? He's like sort of dead. I mean, he was in a pit, right? I don't know if you guys ever saw the movie Princess Bride.
Of course.
Right? So you remember like the miracle, Mad Max, the Miracle Man, right? He says when the hero dies in the middle, he's like, well, there's dead and there's like really dead. And
Yeah. And they bring him back to life.
Bring him back to life. So it's like Joseph is like, he's sort of dead. I mean, Jacob thinks he's dead, but like he could come back from the dead. All these guys can kind of come back. So if you think about that's the structure of the Judah story, what Judah did to Joseph. And now think about what happened. That's Genesis 37. And now get to Genesis 38, who the Anchor Bible says, oh, that's a different story. That has nothing to do with the Joseph story. And ask yourself, 1 second, what's happening to Judah now? How many children does Judah have from Tamar? Not from his first wife, Shua, right? He's got 3 kids, right? What are their names? Er, Onan, and Shelah, right? Now, let's talk about what happens to his 3 kids. So interesting. So there were 3 kids that are going to be lost to Jacob because of Judah's actions. And now there's 3 kids that belong to Judah. So what happens to Judah, this architect of the sale of Joseph? First thing that happens is he loses Er. Er, the Bechor, dies. Well, what happened to Jacob? He lost his Bechor also. He lost Joseph. Why, by the way, did he lose Joseph? What did the brothers have against Joseph? He brought back Dibatam Ra'ah El Aviam. He brought back bad Diba about their people. Well, why does Judah end up losing Er? Vayihi Er Ra Beinei Hashem. Er was Ra. There's that word. So both parents lose their first child for the same reason, Ra, right? So there's this one child who's gone. But then if I asked you, I said, well, is Er really gone? Is he dead? Is he good and gone and can never come back? Well, on the one hand, he's dead. But on the other hand, what does Judah say after Er dies? He says to Onan, I need you, Onan, to marry the wife of Er, the widow of Er, the Yabemota, and you should perform this quasi-act of Yibum.
Yeah.
What's the whole point of Yibum?
To continue the name.
To continue the name, to continue the legacy of the dead man, so that his name is not destroyed from the world, so that there is something of him that continues in the world, right? So, now Kabbalistically, there's this notion of the actual soul of the deceased being reincarnated in the soul of the child, but whether the soul actually continues at some level, even halachically, you find that Yibum is very similar. What does Yibum do? Yibum is, you don't have to have a new act of kiddushin, you don't have to have a new act of marriage in Yibum. You just step into the shoes of the deceased. It's like the deceased hasn't really died. It's as if his marriage is still there. It's like he's on life support, and somehow if you can rescue his legacy, his soul, by just sort of stepping into his shoes. It's almost like
a continuance.
It's a certain kind of continuance. So isn't it strange that not only does Jacob lose Joseph his Bechor as Judah loses his Bechor, but they lose their Bechor in the same way, which is that both of them, both children, are only quasi-dead, right? Both of them can come back, right? Joseph can come back in some way, and Judah's child, Er, can come back. So what happens is the Er is Ra, he's lost, and then Onan. What happens to Onan? Well, it turns out that Onan is not interested in having a child that will continue on the legacy of Er. So Onan is intimate with Tamar in a way that doesn't allow her to become pregnant. God sees that, is displeased with what Onan did, and Vayamet Gamoto, and he gets rid of him. So what happens? Why would you say Onan is lost? Onan is lost because he failed to show loyalty to his older brother Er, who was lost.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Well, 1 second, why was Shimon lost again? Because he failed to show loyalty to his older brother Yosef, who was lost. So isn't it fascinating that you just lost 2 children in exactly the same way that he caused 2 children to be lost by his own father? First, there's this one child that's quasi-dead, and then there's this other child that gets lost because they fail to show loyalty to the older brother and fail to do anything for him. So now Judah's down 2 children, just like Jacob was down 2 children. And he's in a similar situation to Jacob. Well, here's the thing. He's worried about sending the 3rd child, Shelah, to Tamar.
Oh, wow. Yeah, wow. Nice.
Have we ever met somebody who was down 2 children and was worried about sending 1 more children to get lost like the other 2? That was Jacob, right? Jacob was down 2 children. He's not going to send Benjamin, right? Because pen yikra ason, something might happen to him, Jacob says. Judah won't send Shelah, pen yamut gamhu ke'echav, lest he die just like his brothers, right? Except there's an irony in that, because if he would just, we know something that Judah doesn't know. We know that it's not Tamar's fault that Er died. It's not Tamar's fault that Onan dies. Tamar is disguised. He doesn't know who this woman is, right? If he would only realize who this woman is, that she's not responsible for that. She's good, right? If he would only just willingly let Shelah go, who would he get back in Yibum? He would get back children that would continue the legacies of his lost children. The quasi-dead would come right back. But he doesn't want to do that because he doesn't know who Tamar really is, because she's disguised, right? And just like Jacob doesn't want to do it, Jacob doesn't want to send Binyamin. So what does Judah happens to Judah? Judah gets put in exactly the same position that he put his father in. Down 2 children, unwilling to send the third, but if he would only send the third, he could get back all 3. And what happens? At that moment, he hears those words, Hakerna, right? The same words that he used to perpetrate this deception upon his own father. And he's got to figure out a way out. And he does. What does he do? He collateral. He redeems an eravon under very difficult circumstances. He's willing to take terrible consequences. He gave this scandal of all of this, he condemned this woman to death, and he gave her this collateral, and now he has to show, she presents that collateral, now he has to take that collateral and show that it's really his and take the consequences wherever they may lead, right? Collateral? Eravon? Do we remember collateral in the Joseph story anywhere? Oh, there sure is an Erav. Anochi ervenu. Same word, eravon, with the nun. I will be his collateral, Judah says later. Isn't it fascinating? The story of Judah and Tamar is laying the groundwork for what Judah does, his heroic act in Judah and Tamar lays the groundwork for his heroic act in actually getting Benjamin back. In other words, getting his father to send Benjamin. Do you understand? He had to dig his father out of the same hole that he was in.
Yeah.
My father ends up not willing to part with Benjamin. So who's the only one who can let Benjamin go so that all 3 people can come back? The person who's already lost 2 children in exactly the same kind of way. The person who's figured out how to redeem collateral pledges himself as collateral and says, you can trust me, I'll bring Benjamin home. And that finally gives his father the strength, and Judah digs his father out of the hole that he eventually dug for himself. So the connections between the stories aren't just literary devices that show the unity of the story. God didn't put them there because he wanted to disprove biblical criticism.
Right.
God put them there so that you can understand how Genesis 38 is part and parcel of the whole story, so that you can understand the meaning of divine justice, God doesn't let things just happen.
And if I may, it extends to the Navi also, because you also brought up in another one of your shiurim on Aleph Beta, the story of, you mentioned the coat, right? And the only 2 times this pasuk is mentioned, that nafsho kshura benafsho, which is my soul is, or my I'm connected, right? That whole thing is only mentioned one other place, which is in the story of David and Yonatan, where it's again playing out the descendant of Binyamin and descendant of Yehuda. So,
Yeah.
so it's showing the payback, like the loyalty, like you saved my ancestor, and therefore I'm going to give you this royal garb. And for all those who are listening, I suggest you go to that Aleph Beta segment as well. It's so incredible how, like you said, there's not 3 or 4 links, there's 20, 30 links all over the Tanakh.
Yeah. And so these stories continue in marvelous, magical ways and resonate with each other. The reason why the links are there is because they create these "you're not in Kansas" moments anymore, right? Where all of a sudden everything comes in 3 dimensions, and then and you understand what's going on there. But if you happen to be challenged by biblical criticism, the links also show the unity of the text, right? But the unity of the text needs to be dug to. You need to dig into the text to begin to see the themes that connect it to surrounding text. So this is, and again, Genesis 38 is a cardinal example of biblical criticism of the documentary hypothesis. It's textbook documentary hypothesis. But once you see this, it's not just like, oh, I have another explanation. I could explain this way. I could explain this that way. I could explain this that way. No, I have a simple, unified explanation for all of the discrepancies that you're seeing, right? That underneath it, it's just not possible to see Genesis 38 as anything but part and parcel.
It totally destroys their case, the biblical critics, because it's so hard for them to respond to that. And actually, one thing that if I may, one of our previous guests, Rabbi Joshua Berman, he was actually on Yoram Hazoni's podcast or his YouTube channel, and he mentioned the fact that they were talking about the fact that there's these color-coded books, Torahs, that have all 4 different authors, right? And when it would be, let's say, in pink when it's the J, and then in yellow when it's the E, and so on. And he said, just logically speaking, it can't be cohesive. You can't like stitch all these things together and have it make sense. That's the other hard part that they have to do. Like, how is it that these texts came together and actually are still cohesive?
Right. And this is just a deeper level of that, right? Because I'm just showing that they're not just cohesive at the surface level. They're cohesive at all these different levels, right?
Exactly.
It's imagine like you're doing surgery, and the surgery, you have to stitch together 15 layers of muscle together. That's what's happening here. There's all these different layers in which everything is interweaving, and it just, you can't do surgery at that level textually. It just doesn't work out unless it's a unified author. Or again, the possibility is, another way of thinking about it is that you have a redactor who's really, really smart, who is like superhuman smart, right? The redactor that's able to do things with text that no human that we know is able to do with text. But once you're there, you're basically up to calling that redactor God, right? In other words, like, you know what I mean? Because
so I was actually going to say this, is that more so than just like, okay, establishing a single author, really, and what I, at least, I mean, I've been following your Aleph Beta for many, many years. From the very beginning, for me, this was like almost like it's impossible to say that there's no divinity behind this. This is not even the work of one person. Right. It can't be. You know what I mean? It's almost impossible to say that one man can
have this kind of wisdom,
can create this tapestry.
Yes.
So forget biblical criticism. I'd go a step further and say that this is really opening up the divinity aspect in an incredible way. I always felt that when I was listening to the methodologies that you were bringing out.
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, right. To me, the wonderful thing about this, what's in it for me in all this work in Aleph Beta really is that sense of wonder. One of the religious qualities that we're asked to cultivate in ourselves is not just love of God, but yirat haram, a sense of awe of the grandeur of God. And awe is, it's hard to come by those awe nowadays. We use the word a lot. We use the word awesome all the time without really having a sense of awe. But there are rare moments where we can catch a glimpse of awe. You go to the Grand Canyon, you look at, you look at the stars at night on a grassy knoll when it's quiet. You look at the ocean and the sunset, and sometimes you can get these moments of awe in nature. But the beautiful thing about Judaism is you can get those moments of awe from the book too, right? We don't have a book like any other. It's a book like no other. And it's a book that cultivates love of God and cultivates awe of God at the same time. Not just a book that tells you you have to love God and you have to be in awe of God. It's a book that actually helps you feel those things once you look into it. And that's a real privilege to be able to feel those things as you study. So let me jump in. I'll give you one other example of this. Again, and you can find a couple. I mentioned before there were a couple series in Aleph Beta to look at. I just gave you little excerpts from the story of Judah and Tamar, but you can look at the Joseph piece and Judah and Tamar on alephbeta.org or ab.video. And there's two other series there which are kind of deep dives. Many of the things we do are an hour-long piece on the holidays or 10-minute pieces on Parsha, but there are a couple deep dives. One of them is, I think, an 85-part series of videos, just 5-minute videos, but 85 of them on the Joseph story. And the second unit there is on chapter 38 on the story of Judah and Tamar. So I recommend people check that out if they're interested. Two other pieces is pieces that really go back to the beginning of biblical criticism, which is on Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. One of them is called Genesis Unveiled. And I'll just tell you something about Genesis Unveiled because it does impact biblical criticism as well, particularly that color-coded book by Richard Friedman, which you were mentioning, about the Bible with sources revealed. So Genesis Unveiled, I'll just give you a short little introduction to the course to give you a sense of what it does. Genesis Unveiled picks up on an insight which I think I first saw where did I first see this insight? Maybe I came up with it myself, or maybe I didn't see it anywhere. Well, I'll tell you what the insight is. If you happen to have a Chumash and you flip open to Genesis chapter 8 for a moment.
Which pasuk?
Just the beginning. Vayizkor Elokim et Noach v'et kol hachayav v'et kol ha'behema asher yirah b'teva. The flood has come and has destroyed all of humanity, and God remembers Noach and all of the animals inside the ark. And then Vaya'aver Elokim ruach ha'la'aretz vayashoku hamayim. And God causes a wind to blow upon the earth, right? That's covered with all these waters, and the waters begin to recede. Now, let me ask you something. There's a game I play in Aleph Beta, the intertextual game. Where have we heard these words before? Where have we heard an idea like this before in the Bible? Vaya'aver Elokim, realize that ruach is a word that can have two meanings. Ruach can mean wind, but
And
what
spirit.
else? It can also mean spirit, right? Where else do we have, right, a
In
spirit
the creation.
of God, right,
The-
sort of passing over a world when the world is full of water, right?
Right.
What does it remind you of?
In the creation, in the beginning of
creation.
Genesis.
Go back to the second verse of creation. Reshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, right? In the beginning, when God was creating the heavens and the world, va'aretz hayta tohu vavohu. The world was chaotic. The choshech al pnei tehom. There was darkness on the face of the deep. And here's those words: v'ruach Elokim. See those words? Ruach Elokim. A ruach of God, merachefet, was fluttering, was hovering al pnei hamayim, over the face of the waters. It's as if the whole world was filled with waters. It was dark. It was chaotic, which must have meant there were waves crashing everywhere. By the way, what image does that remind you of? I would say, what image later in the Torah does it remind you of a world that's completely dark, a water world, a world that's chaotic with waves crashing everywhere? Where else do I get that image in the Torah aside from the beginning of Genesis? Sure sounds a lot like
Noach.
a flood.
Oh yeah.
It's as if the Torah is painting a picture of a flood, right? Almost like you have flood version 1 pre-creation, flood version 2, right? So when the sages in the Midrash talk about the flood being that God is being machzir et ha'olam latohu vavohu, is returning the world to its original state of chaos, they weren't just coming up with nonsense, right? They were noticing this, that the way the Torah structures the verses of pre-creation and the structure, the world of the flood, are as if they're the same kinds of worlds in a strange way. And you have this same language, the Ruach Elokim, which was hovering over the waters. Now again, there's this Ruach, this wind from Elokim that's fluttering, that's hovering over the waters. Now, you might say that, see that, and again, say it's a coincidence, right? But the intertextual game isn't just about one connection. Can you find more connections, right?
Well, the water recedes. Doesn't God separate the water from the land?
Exactly. And look at the very next verse in Genesis Genesis chapter 8. Very next verse, Genesis 8, chapter 2. Vayisachru mayinot tahom, and God stopped up the waters of the deep, right? Va'arubot hashamayim, and the storehouses of the heavens. Those are poetic terminology, but mayinot tahom, the fountains of the deep. In other words, the way the flood was created wasn't just through rainwater. It was also through groundwater. It was groundwater coming up from the ground, and when groundwater and rainwater united, right, the groundwater coming from below and the rainwater coming from above, from the clouds, that's when you created the flood. So how does God stop the flood? Vayisachru mayinot tahom. God stops up the waters of the deep, so there's no more water coming from the ground, right? Va'arubot hashamayim, and he stops the storehouses of heavens, which means the clouds, from raining, right? And there's no more rain. And that was the second thing that happened. Well, that's the second thing that happens with Noah. What's the second thing that happens back in pre-creation? Right after we hear about that wind of God hovering over the waters, right? The next thing I hear is, I've got this light, and right after light, I have God saying, Yehi rakia b'toch hamayim. Let there be, that rakia is sometimes translated as firmament, but you and I usually think of rakia as sky, right? Let there be sky b'toch hamayim, in the middle of the waters. And fascinatingly, Vayihi mavdil ben mayim lamayim. It's going to separate between water and waters. Which waters? Well, Vayas Elokim et harakia, vayavdel ben hamayim asher mitachat l'rakia, uben hamayim me'al harakia. God actually created sky to separate between upper waters, which we might call clouds, and lower waters, which you might call waters underneath the clouds, seas, groundwaters, things like that. So isn't it fascinating that in creation, I have sky separating between upper waters and lower waters. And here in the world after the flood, right after I have a reference to the Ruach of God fluttering over the waters, I have God taking the upper waters and pushing them back up to the clouds, so the water vapor stays up in the clouds, and groundwater stays below, and what's in between but sky. One more time, there's a separation between upper and lower waters.
So is that suggesting that kind of like it's like a recreation, like as if it's a new world now after the flood? Right. Okay, I understand.
So do you understand? So what happens, I won't show you this now, but these are just two examples. These two examples, you could say, oh, I don't know, Fohrman's a creative guy, maybe it's a coincidence. But what if I showed you a third example in order, a fourth example in order? These examples keep on going. You can read as you keep on reading, right? Look at the next thing that happens. Look at the next verse in Genesis chapter 8, verse 3. Vayashuvu hamayim al ha'aretz haloch vashov, vayichasru hamayim mikseh chamishim batayom, v'tanach hateva b'chodesh hashvi al harei Ararat. The waters recede, and the ark rests on dry land. I have the advent of dry land as waters recede. What does that remind you of? Back in the story of creation. What's the next thing that happens in the story of creation? Go to day 3, chapter 1, verse 9. Vayomer Elokim, yikavu hamayim mitachat hashamayim el makom echad, v'tera et hayabasha. Let the waters gather themselves to one place, and let dry land appear. Well,
the mountain appears.
The mountain appears. Do you understand?
Yeah.
At a certain point, it's not a coincidence anymore, right? I've shown you 3 connections in order between the stories. And if I showed you a 4th and a 5th and a 6th and a 7th, right? And then you ask, well, what's the purpose of sections? So the purpose of these sections, again, isn't to disprove Bible criticism, isn't to disprove those who say Genesis 8 is a different author than Genesis 1, right? The purpose of it is to tell you something. What does it tell you? It tells you exactly what you guys were suggesting, which is that there's meaning to this. It's saying that the way to understand the world after the flood is different than you might suspect. The language that you used is that it was a recreation. And by the way, that's different than most people might have thought, right? If you and I had this discussion before we started noticing these connections, let's say, what was the purpose of the flood? So most people would say the purpose of the flood was to destroy mankind. But if the purpose of the flood was just to destroy mankind, then after the flood, all God would have to do is repopulate the earth with people again. But what do you see from here? That wasn't what God was doing. He wasn't just repopulating the world. He was recreating the world, which means that the target of the flood wasn't just mankind. It was actually the world. The world was being destroyed. Creation was being undone. God was, as the sage is saying, being machzir ha'olam latov vavo. He was bringing the world back to its original state. He was destroying creation, right? And you see it now that you see this, by the way, if you look in Noah, you'll actually see in Noah that this is true, but you never noticed it before, right? Look at the language at the beginning of Noah. The language at the beginning of Noah, over and over, what was the problem that God had? Vatishachet haaretz lifnei Elokim. The world, the Aretz became corrupted. Vatimale haaretz Hamas, and the world was filled with violence. Vayar Elokim et haaretz, and God saw the Aretz v'hinei nishchata, and it was ruined. Why? Ki hishchit kol basar et darko al haaretz, because all flesh had corrupted their way on the Aretz. What word appears over and over again in that verse? Aretz. Aretz, Aretz. The world was ruined. The world was ruined. The world. How did the world get ruined? People corrupted their ways, but they ruined the world. It wasn't just about the people anymore. It was about the environment. The whole environment was destroyed. God's world had been destroyed. God felt I was left with no choice but to renovate. I had to go back, send the construction team in, demolition, take apart everything. I'm living through that now in our house. We were demolishing part of our house. We're camping out at the bottom. It's very hard to live through a demolished house. It wasn't just that God was destroying mankind. God was destroying the world. Mankind was just collateral damage. It was just like, sorry guys, I've got to renovate. You destroyed the world. You're not going to have any place to live for a while. So I'm going to take a little bit of you and put them in this boat. Then we'll repopulate the earth. That was what was going on. It changes your view of the flood. The flood was, and what it also means is that the world after the floods, which was a much larger project, it wasn't just repopulating the earth, it was actually recreating, it was a second creation, which leads to the very interesting question, was it the same or did it differ? Was there a difference between the second creation and the first creation? And as you go and see the second creation unfold, the second creation unfolds in connection to the first creation. Everything that happens in the second creation connects to something that happens in the first creation, but in some key ways, things change, leading to a different world. A different world begins to unfold. So Genesis Unveiled is the course that deals with this. And again, the point of Genesis Unveiled is to talk about the implications of these connections between texts. But what we're doing in Genesis Unveiled is asking sort of a playful thing, which is how far can you go in Genesis 8 and Genesis 9 and Genesis 10 and Genesis 11 and continue to see these connections one by one by one leading to the world of creation? And the answer is pretty far, right?
Wow.
Amazing.
The entire creation story gets paralleled in recreation. Not only the entire creation story, but then what happens after creation. It turns out that there's a Sabbath story in the world of recreation. There's a story in the world of recreation which is littered with language from the Sabbath, so much so that as you're reading that story, you think you're making Kiddush on Shabbos afternoon because it has all the language of the Sabbath in it. And you know what that story is? It's the rainbow. It turns out that Noah and the rainbow is recreation's version of the Sabbath. Well, that's pretty interesting. That forces you to ask, well, how does the rainbow comment on the Sabbath? Like, if I really want to understand the Sabbath, I've got to understand how the rainbow is a version of the Sabbath, right? That's pretty interesting. What the Sabbath is to creation number one, the rainbow is to creation number two, right? And then you begin to see it. 1 second, the Sabbath was God's decision to stop creating. Never again would he create the way, right? He was done, right? And in being done, there was a certain stability to the world, right? I ask mankind, I say to man, pru'ervu and miluat haaretz. Go and be fruitful and multiply and fill the world. Well, if you were Adam, that Aleph Beta methodology from before, actually inhabit the personhood of Adam, just like we did with the daughter of Pharaoh and her maidservant before. If you were Adam, right, Ben, if I asked you and I said, hi, I'm God, and you're Adam, and you've just been created on the 6th day of creation, I would like you to be fruitful and multiply and fill the world with your progeny. Tell me about that. Do you feel ready to do that? Are you a little nervous about procreating and filling the world with your progeny? If you're a skeptical type of Adam, what might you be looking at? Remember, Shabbos hasn't happened yet. All you've been looking at is the sixth day, and say you know about what happened on the previous days. What might you be worried about if you don't know about Shabbos? Let me ask you, when, in general, forget Adam, just you. When are you ready to get married? What, right, in life, what do you need in order to feel like I'm kind of ready to get
A
married?
job, a way of providing.
Yeah.
I gotta have a way of making the world safe for my kids. I gotta have a way of providing. I gotta have a house. I gotta have something, right? If everything's all in flux, I'm not gonna have kids, right? So if you're Adam, you take that mindset, I gotta have a house, right? I gotta have some stability. I gotta have some safety before I have some kids. And you look at God and you say, God, you're very powerful. All I see is every single day you're just using your creativity, making something incredibly new that nobody even heard about before, right? So today you decided to make all the animals and people, and you said, I'm in charge. That's great on day 6, but what's on day 7? What's on day 8? What's on day 9? Tyrannosaurus Rex who talks? You let me know when you're done creating, God, and then we'll talk about having kids.
There's an uncertainty in the whole. I understand.
Sabbath creates stability to the world. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, Rabbi Fohrman, unfortunately, I personally do have to go. Benji is going to finish the podcast. Keep going. I just have to go because whatever it is, Benji is going to finish the podcast with you. It was an honor to meet you. And I hope we do it again.
Okay, great.
God willing.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to hear the rest towards later on, but Benji's going to take over for the final thing. Right. I'm so sorry about that. I apologize.
Right. So do you see what's happening? What you've got is a world of recreation where there's this Sabbath-like event, and the Sabbath-like event is a way of creating stability because God says, I'm not mess with your stability by keeping on creating. I'm going to stop creating. Well, now, if the language of the rainbow echoes that of Sabbath, it's Sabbath's version in the world of recreation in Noah's world. So in what sense is the rainbow a Sabbath-like event? What would Noah be worried about? If you're Noah and you got commanded, like Adam, be fruitful and multiply and have your progeny fill the world, which he was commanded in his version of day 6. If you were Noah and you were feeling a little nervous,
like the same thing happening all over again. Like why wouldn't the world go into chaos again?
You can see it, by the way, if you watch that movie Noah that I forgot who it was.
Darren Aronofsky made it. I think it was, who was the actor? Russell Crowe, maybe?
Russell Crowe, right? And who was it? Emma Thompson? I forget who.
Yes, yeah.
And so, and he kind of picks up on this, which is like the trauma that Noah must have experienced. Imagine Noah, who literally witnessed the end of the world. He would be like, God, you let me know when you're done destroying, and then how do I know you're not going to do this again? You want me to have kids so you can wipe them all out too, right? So God has to say, no, there's stability. So the same God who once upon a time told Adam, I'm done creating, with the rainbow told Noah, I'm done destroying, right? No, so the rainbow is a perfect inverse of the Sabbath. It's the complement of the Sabbath, right? So what happens if you look at Genesis Unveiled is, again, you begin to see the entire Genesis structure story, which is where the different authors begin in biblical criticism. And you begin to see how the Genesis story is went into the rest of Genesis, part and parcel, in a way that if you pick up Richard Friedman or any of these other texts that tries to argue that the Bible's fragmented, connects the different fragments in these kinds of ways, which is right there just under the surface of the text, that as you keep on reading Genesis 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you see this very intricate structure of these events that play off the events of creation in these remarkable kinds of ways, again, leading to what seems to be the unity of the text.
Amazing. And what about the 2 accounts of the creation of Adam, which you mentioned that is that coming out on your channel? Is already there?
Yeah. So let me talk briefly about that, and I'll be right back to do that. Let me just grab one thing, and I'll be right with you.
No problem.
So same methodology, right? The methodology is biblical criticism wants to argue that there's a fragmented text, that there's a Genesis creation account 1, there's a Genesis creation account 2, and never the twain shall meet. And these are two separate things, and they were constructed by two different authors, and some creator redactor threw them together, hoping you would never notice. But we begin to see that there's two different accounts. So what I want to do firstly is just show you some evidence that that's not true, right? That the contrary is true, that it's impossible to read Genesis 1 without Genesis 2, and it's impossible to read Genesis 2 without Genesis 1. They are a unitary text in ways that are impossible to explain without seeing them as part and parcel of the same thing. Now, I'm not going to explain more than that. You might ask me, well, if that's true, still, why are there two creation stories? There should just be one creation story. That's an interesting question. We can discuss that. You might ask me, well, what's the significance of this story and that story? That's also interesting. We can discuss that. But first, let's just start with the evidence. The evidence that from a language standpoint, it's not true. The two stories are relying on one another and playing off of each other in ways that are impossible to explain if each one was complete on their own. So let's begin, if you would, with the first three verses of each story. Okay, so what I want to show you is the first three verses of story number 1, and then the first three verses of story number 2. And okay, on the left-hand side, you'll find the first verse of Genesis number 1, the first creation story. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, or the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just diagram that sentence for you, right? It's a fairly straightforward sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's got a subject, it's got a verb, and it's got an object, right? Who's the subject who does the creating?
Hashem.
God. Elokim. What does he do, this Elokim? He creates, right? Bereshit bara Elokim. What does he create? What's the object that he creates?
Shamayim and Aretz.
Shamayim and Aretz. So it's pretty simple. I have a subject, God. I have a verb, create. And I have an object of creation, Shamayim and Aretz. Now, look at the second account of creation. Eila toldot Shamayim v'aretz. Well, actually, I don't have the whole thing here. Where do I have the whole thing? I don't have the whole thing here. So let me take you into a different document. This is Ala Torah. Look at the first verse of creation number 2. Eile toldot hashamayim v'aretz bihi baram, b'yom asot Hashem Elokim eretz v'shamayim. These are the generations of heaven and earth in their being created on the day of God's making heaven and earth. That's a very hard to understand verse, right? But do you recognize any elements of the first verse in creation story number 1 in this first verse of creation story 2?
It's, I mean, the same elements of creating Shamayim and Aretz.
Okay, so the word Shamayim
and
so
bara.
Bara Elokim et Shamayim v'et Aretz. So I have Shamayim and Aretz. What else do I have?
The shoresh of bara.
The shoresh of bara is in bihi baram. Okay, what else? Bereshit bara Elohim.
Oh, Elokim is there.
Elokim is there. Okay. All right. So I've got all of those key words in my subject, verb, and object. I've got my Elokim word, who is the subject of who did the creation. I've got my bara word, who is the verb for the creation. And I've got my objects of creation, Shamayim v'aretz. But I want you to now look at the structure of this verse and see what just happened to these three things. And actually open your mind to what's happening here. Eila toldot. If I started a verse with Eila toldot, forget this verse. Can you think of any other verses in the Torah that begin with Eila toldot? These are the generations of?
I mean, it happens with a lot of people. Like I think it's Noach, Terach.
These are the generations of Terach. These are the generations of Noach.
Yes,
These are the generations of
Esav, even.
Esav. These are the generations of Isaac. Got all these Elah Toldot, right? But
Mhm.
this one is unique. What's different about Elah Toldot Shamayim Va'aretz that's different than Elah Toldot Terach? Elah Toldot Noach.
There's no person as a subject.
There's no person as a subject. How can you say these are the generations of when there's no person? These are the generations of heaven and earth. What a crazy thing to say. What does it even mean to say these are the generations of heaven and earth? But now, instead of dismissing it as crazy, let's just take it as if it's actually real. Let's draw the surprising, astounding conclusion that the second account of creation wants you to see. If I'm telling you, Elah Toldot Shemayim Va'aretz, these are the generations of heaven and the earth, how is Genesis 2 treating Shemayim and Aretz? If it were like, these are the generations of Terach,
Oh,
these
okay,
are
I
the
see what you mean.
generations
Okay,
of Abraham.
right.
These
It's
are
treating it the
gen-
same way. Like the world is like the same way as the
And what way is that? How am I treating Noach if I say these are the generations of Noach? Who was Noach?
like as if it's his offspring.
Yes.
Yes.
And therefore, who is Noach? Noach is a
Ancestor.
or a parent,
The parent, right?
right? So Elah Toldot Shemayim Va'aretz means, what are Shemayim Va'aretz in this new way of looking at creation?
Oh, I see. Okay, so they're like the parents.
They just became the subjects who create, not the objects.
Uh-huh.
Welcome to a world that sees creation differently. There's
Mm.
two ways of seeing creation. One way to see creation is God. God is the creator. He makes everything. That's true. You could see creation that way. There's another way to see creation. You know what the creators are? You know who mom and dad are? Shemayim and Aretz are the creators.
Uh-huh.
Well, are you telling me Shemayim and Aretz are the only creators? No, Behibaram. These are the generations of heaven and earth in their being created. I.e., we already talked about God as the creator, but even as they're being created, there's another kind of creation going on. Shemayim va'aretz are themselves parents who are creating, and that's part of the process of creation too. It's almost like a Russian doll theory of creation. You understand? You know the Russian dolls?
Of course.
Right? That on the one hand,
The
biggest
babushkas.
Russian doll is God. God is the arch creator who goes and creates anything. But inside of that, Bihi Baram, inside of that creation, in the process of creation, there's another creation happening. And that creation inside the second Russian doll is welcome to two new parents who are creators. And those parents are Shemayim Va'aretz themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So what just happened? The objects of creation have now become the subjects. What if we saw Shemayim Va'aretz as the parents of creation? And by the way, there's very contemporary ramifications to this, because I've only begun to sketch out this theory, but you can already see some of the implications of the theory. For example, even think of the theory of evolution at some level. You would say, is it possible to believe in the theory of evolution if you're a religious person, right? Well, the question of who the creator is, it kind of depends, right? On one hand, you could say, God's making everything. On the other hand, you can say, well, heaven and earth are making everything. There's some sort of natural evolutionary process that is sort of happening where the world is creating itself.
Yes.
Well,
Hashem is creating these laws, and the laws have a ripple effect.
Yes. Or there's the one way you could see creation is God is creator putting everything in place. Right. But another way you could look at the same process is from inside the Russian doll is don't look at that outer picture of God and just look at what's happening. You'll see Shemayim Va'aretz developing. So what's the interaction between heaven and earth? Is heaven is the sky and earth is the ground. The interaction between sky and ground, which is life-giving, is rain.
Hmm.
And what's the result of rain? Fertility,
Hmm.
grasses, vegetation, right? So this is how sky and ground are parents, as it were, right? The interaction between them is going to be rain. There's going to be this vegetation that comes. So what I want to do now is compare verse 2 in each story, right? Let's look at verse 2. What's verse 2 about in Genesis number 1? So I'll share my screen with you. Back to Genesis number 1.
Mhm.
But the world was completely chaotic, and there was darkness on the face of the earth. And there was a wind of God that was hovering over the waters, right? The same verse that we talked about before. Now, if I would say to you, okay, Benji, right? Tell me what problems God, the creator, faced if he wanted to build a world in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. You actually have 3 problems. What are the 3 problems? Imagine God, right? Master architect, he's looking to build a universe, but the universe is as described in verse 2. What are the problems? The world was chaotic. Choshech al pnei tehom, there was darkness on the face of the deep. And Ruach Elokim rachaf al pnei mayim, the wind of God was hovering over the waters. So I'd say there's 3 problems. One problem is there's too much water. I mean, there's only so much you can build in a water world. We're picturing just this entire water world, right? I need some dry land. I need some like basic things that I can just build on. Problem number 1 is too much water. I got to get rid of some of this water. Problem number 2 is choshech al pnei tehom. It's too dark to see anything, and I'm never going to get anywhere with just complete pitch darkness everywhere. Got to get some light on the situation. And problem number 3 is haita tov vavo. Everything's crashing all over the place. All these waves. Everything's chaotic. There's no order here. We got to have a sense of stability and order. All this chaos has got to stop. So I really got 3 problems. One is too much dynamism and chaos, too much moving around. That's tov vavo. Problem number 2 is too much darkness. And problem number 3 is too much water, right?
Yes.
That is the problem in Genesis 1, stage 2. Now I want to go to creation story 2, and you'll find fascinatingly that the second verse in creation story 2 is devoted to the same thing in creation story 2, which is the problem. We might even title the best title for both verses, for both stage 2, is Welcome to the Problem that God has to deal with in order to solve the problem of how you're going to begin creating. Let's look at the problem in creation story 2 in its second verse. But there was no vegetation in the land yet. Nothing had begun to grow yet. Why? God never made it rain upon the land. There was no man to work the land, even if it would rain. So now, give me the picture of things as we open the story. I want you to just imagine you are a space explorer who has landed on the world at this moment in time. And you're just looking at this world as described, which is, this is a story of Shamayim va'aretz as parents, as heaven and earth as parents, but we're starting the story before there was ever any rain. So what are you doing? You're standing, there was never any rain. There was never any cloud in the sky that even caused the first thunderstorm or rain. So all there was sun beating down, never any rain. God soon is going to cause the clouds to coalesce into rain, but that hasn't happened yet. So what does the land look like if there was never any rain? Is there anything?
Barren.
It's barren, right? Now the sun is beating down on it, right? So the sun is beating down on it. And now would you say it's dynamic or static? Would you say there's all this stuff happening? Or would you say, no, everything is pretty much just the way it is?
It's just the way it is, because it requires a man to till,
No man, there's no life. All there is barren sand dunes, barren parched earth, right? On baking under a hot sun because there's no rain. relate the problem of world 2 to the problem of world 1.
It's all chaos. It's not there's no structure. Yeah.
The problem with world 1 was too much dynamism. Everything is too chaotic. The problem with world 1 is not enough movement. Nothing's going on. Everything is just static, right? That's the static chaos problem. That was problem number 1. But another problem with world number 1 was that it was all dark. Everything was all dark. Well, what's the problem with world number 2? The sun's beating down on everything. There's not a cloud in the sky. It's too light. Not going to get anywhere with this. How are we going to get any rain? Right? And if the problem with world 1 was Ruach Halakim Ra'achefet al Pnei Hamayim, it was just a water world and there's no land, what's the problem with this world?
There's no man.
Hashem ala aretz. God had never even made a drop of rain come. No water at all. The two worlds are a complete inverse of each other. World number 1 is a world in which God creates, and heaven and earth are the creators, are the objects of creation. In that world, there were certain problems. But if I look later in the Russian dolls, if I start to see heaven and earth as the creators, then there was a moment where the opposite was the problem. The problem wasn't too much chaos. The problem was too much static. The problem wasn't too much darkness. The problem was too much light. The problem wasn't too much water. The problem was not enough water. Now, you tell me that these two stories aren't relating to each other.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? Of course they're relating to each other. What it means, how I'm supposed to understand it, we can argue about, but that they're relating to each other, they're relating to each other. Right? So you might say, no, it's a coincidence, I don't know. But what if I could show you that it's not just the first 2 verses, it's the 3rd verse too, right? It happens a 3rd time, right? So let's look at the 3rd verse in creation story 1. Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, Vayehi Or. So God said, let there be light, right? And all of a sudden, God turned on the lights, and with that light, there was going to be the beginnings of everything that would come. Everything that would come is going to be, in some way or another, a function of that light, right? And what did God do with that light? The first thing he did was, God decided he had to make a very important distinction between light and darkness. This is light, this is darkness. Never will light and darkness interfere with one another, right? Light and darkness. Now look at the 3rd verse in Genesis 2. We might call the 3rd verse in each story stage 3 of creation. And if we labeled, and let's just give labels to verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3 of each story. What's the best label you would give to verse 1? Who is the creator and who is the created? Right? Verse 1 tells you in story 1, God is the creator, the created is heaven and earth. Story 2, verse 1 tells you, no. The creator is heaven and earth, right? God is kind of on the sides, helping things along maybe, but God is the master creator, but we're looking at heaven and earth as creators right now. Okay. So who is the creator and who is the created is the title for stage 1. Stage 2 is the problem. I've got 3 problems in world 1, and I've the 3 opposite problems in world 2. Okay, now let's get to the 3rd verse. The 3rd verse is the solution. What's the solution in each world? Well, the solution in world 1 is let's have some light and let's divide the light from the darkness. Well, if world 2 is the inverse of world 1 so far, what would we expect the inverse of let's have some light and divide the light from the darkness? Remember the problem in world 2. The problem in world 2 wasn't too much darkness, it was too much light.
So now it's too much. Now it's going to be too much darkness. Now it's going to be darkness again.
That's right. So what do I need to do? And what's the opposite of dividing between light and darkness?
Uniting.
uniting light and darkness.
Hmm.
So how do I have a world where there's too much light? What does it look like when I unite light and darkness? I know what it looks like when I divide light and darkness. There's bright light over here, and there's pitch black darkness over there. What if I were to divide light and darkness? Have you ever had a moment in the world, in your experience of the world, where it was neither dark nor light, but kind of both of them together?
Yes.
When?
Like in the middle of the day, right? When it's right before.
Now, when it's sunlight all over the place, it's just light. But when does it start getting a little dark? But it's still sort of light.
Like dusk.
Dusk is possible. But what about in the middle of the day? Does that ever happen? You look outside, it's darker now. Not pitch black, but it's darker.
Yeah.
When does it get darker?
Usually.
When it rains.
Oh, when it rains, yeah, that too.
When there's clouds.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Look at verse 3, the next verse. The aid yalem in aretz. So a mist came up from the ground, coalesced into clouds, the hishka et kol pnei adama, and watered the whole ground. Solution, the advent of water, thunderstorms, right? The mixing of light and dark. Instead of having everything all light, an element of darkness comes and clouds that cover over the sun. You can still sort of see it's this mixture of light and dark, but now there's a solution, but the solution isn't bright light like it was with the Ye'or. The solution is the mixing of light and darkness and the coalescing of water in the sky, which comes down and begins fertility. In other words, if heaven and earth are parents, the interaction between them, the organic interaction between heaven and earth is rain. Rain comes from the heavens, waters the earth, and begins to create the possibility of life. You with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So stage 3 might be the beginnings of a solution. Let's just take a fast look at stage 4. What might stage 4 be? Well, let's look at the next in another sense, right? Look at this next verse over here. Yehi rakia b'toch hamayim vayimavdil bein mayim lamayim. Let there be sky in the midst of the waters, and let there be waters above and waters below, right? That's the division between waters above and waters below, right? And what did we hear about just now in story number 2? A mist, which is water vapor below, coming up to the sky and connecting with sky, seeding humidity in the sky, which then comes down in the form of rain. Do you see how this is the inverse? Instead of there being this division between waters, where there's the upper waters and there's the lower waters, there's now connection between waters. There's humidity below, which connects with the sky, which comes down as rain, and there's unification between heaven and earth, instead of division between the what's above and what's below. You with me?
Yes. It's almost as if the first part is just about the first part of Genesis is giving you the elements that were used, and now they're kind of coming together.
Exactly. It's what happens with the elements. It's God setting up a structure, and then what happens with that structure, which, by the way, brings us to the very last verse in Genesis 1. What's the last verse of creation story? After creation, there was the Sabbath. And take a look at the last verse of the Sabbath story. You'll find it right here. Right before Ela Todat Hashemayim V'Haaretz Bibaram. Vayivarach Elokim et Yom HaShvi. God blessed the seventh day. Vayikadesh oto. And he made it holy. Why? Kivo Shabbat Kol Melachto. On it he rested from all of his labor, all of his creative labor, all of the malacha, all of the work that God was doing in creation 1 is called malacha. Malacha is mental work. It's work where your mind directs your actions and you build, right? That's what malacha is. On it he rested from all of his malacha, asher bara Elokim la'asot, that he created to make. Now, Benji, if you could take out a single word to make that phrase work a little bit better, right? If you could just take a red pen and take out one word, what word would you take out to make that sentence really flow? Kivo shavat mikom lachto asher
Bara Elohim. Elohim. Right?
Elohim.
Yeah.
Stop the sentence there.
Stop it. Yeah.
I'm good. Kivo
Mhm.
shavat mikom lachto asher bara Elohim. God decided to stop from all of the malacha that he created. Done. What do I need that final word? La'asot. La'asot. What does la'asot mean? And all the commentators struggle to understand what that word means. Kivo shavat mikom. And if you read it literally, what does it seem to mean? God rested from all the malacha that he made, la'asot, to do, as if after making all that malacha, there was more to do.
Mhm.
That was just the beginning. He rested from his malacha, but what was the malacha for? Asher bara Elohim, for a purpose. The purpose was asot, was making. Making, what's making? Making something of malacha. How do you make something of malacha? Read the next verse. The first verse in creation story 2. Can you find the word asot? This strange word, Asher bara Elohim, for a purpose. La, what
Yes.
purpose? The purpose of asot.
The Yom
You see
Asot.
the word.
Yes.
That's right. Eile toldot hashamayim v'aretz v'baram. These are the generations of heaven and earth. Heaven and earth, these organic things that come together in their creating. When? Biyom asot, in the day of asot. In the day of asoting, Hashem Elokim eretz v'shamayim. Oh, interesting. So there was another stage of creation. There was a stage where you built everything, and then there was this organic stage of, well, what's going to be with all of this building, with this whole structure? You made a great trellis, but where's the vine? You made a great structure for things, but what's going to emerge out of that organically? Well, there's going to be an asot, a day of asot. By the way, what day is the day of asot? I would go so far as to say, what's the last day we heard of?
The Shabbat.
It's as if Shabbos is the day of asot. In other words, God's resting. Remember, God's seventh day, there is no eighth day. There is no ninth day. The last day is the seventh day, which means, God rested and came to just be in this seventh day. If you had to ask me, where is God now in time? I would tell you he's in the seventh day. God's still resting. He's not making anything. He's resting. There's this eternal Yom Shekulo Shabbos, as the sages will call it, an extended day of Shabbos, which God is in. In other words, creation from that point on, God is at rest, right? He's no longer doing this malacha. He's allowing things to develop as he stands back as rester. So
it harkens us to what Chazal say, that Hashem is constantly creating the world, right?
Yes,
it's a continuation.
In a certain kind of way. There's this. But that was part of the plan. The part of the plan is I'm going to set up this structure, but then there's going to be this other creation, this organic creation, which takes place Yom Asot, and God has a different role in that organic creation. Now is heaven and earth that take the center stage. What was initially created, they take the center stage, and God is going to be on the sides. He's going to be facilitating things. He's going to be saying, heaven, earth, you guys are too separate. You need a little help getting together. I'll play shotgun. I'll put you together. How about a little bit of rain? We'll have a little bit of humidity coming up from the ground. We'll coalesce into clouds. You'll be amazed at what comes from a little bit of rain, right? And that is the Yehi Or of the new world, right? So what I want to show is that, again, the Torah is using this as a way of helping you understand what's emerging in creation. It's not trying to counteract biblical criticism, right?
Exactly.
But it does. Right? It just happens to, because what it's really saying is you can't understand that there's one creation. So I can't tell you one creation story. A lot of things that happen in creation. There are two things that happen in creation. If you want, you can look at only one story, but the truth of it is two stories, and they play off of each other. And what's happening inside the Russian doll number 2 is the inverse of what happens inside Russian doll number 1. And as you begin to look at the two stories, you begin to see astonishingly that there's two different worlds of creation. It's the two different creations are unfolding. And God is occupying a vastly different role in one world than another, which explains the two names of God, Elohim and Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. One world is the world of God as Elohim. Elohim is the builder who creates structure. The builder is interested in what can I build, but that's not what Yud-Kei Vav-Kei Elohim is interested in. Yud-Kei Vav-Kei Elohim is what can I facilitate, right? What organic creativity can I facilitate on the basis of what's built? I'm still a builder. I can still act as Elohim, but I also act as a nurturer. Chazal talk about Elohim and Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. The sages talk about them in terms of midot, right? They'll tell us that Elohim is associated with a midah, with a characteristic of God. What characteristic of God did they tell us Elohim is associated with? We think of din, judgment.
Judgment, yeah.
Right? And when we think of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Yud-Hey and Vav-Hey, we think about a different connotation, not judgment, but rachamim, compassion, right? Almost as if there's this archetypally masculine style of God and an archetypally feminine type of God. Rachamim, interestingly enough, is the word for rechem, for womb, right? God as womb. If I ask you, what does a womb do? A womb facilitates organic growth. Doesn't actually create organic growth, facilitates it, right? What creates the organic growth, right? Egg coming together with sperm is what that's mother and father coming together, but all womb does is provide a perfect environment, shelter, right? Facilitate, offer nutrition, right? Offer, right? And that's God in the second world.
And we see that with the rain that comes down to the ground. It's first infertile and then it becomes fertile. And
that's right. There's mother and father working, and there's the shotgun, there's God as womb, right? I'll give you a safe place. I'll help nurture this along. I'll help this grow, right? This feminine side of God as facilitator, right? Interestingly, the word Yud-Kei and Vav-Kei is very different than the word Elohim. Elohim, the word in Hebrew, El, means power, right? God as Elohim, the sum of all powers, plural, right? As if he has all power. God, one way of thinking about God is very powerful, very masculine, the sum of all powers. God as powerful can start with nothing and can build the heck out of it, right? First, he's got to get rid of all the water, then he's got to turn on the lights, right? Then he's got to get rid of all the chaos, start with something. He's very divide and conquer. I'll put this over there and that over there, darkness over here, light over here, keeps everything separate. The more I can separate things, the more I can build. And this kind of God, by the way, is very judgmental, which is why we're very judgment oriented, right? What's the great judgment that God says over and over again in each day of creation, as the day is done?
Kitov.
Vayar Elohim Kitov. Now, as nice as it sounds that God saw that it was good, there's at least implicitly a judgment there. What if he didn't see that it was good? What would have happened then? What if he looked on day 4 and said, nah, it's not very good? What would have happened?
You would have to solve the problem.
Solve the problem. You have to undo it. It's God evaluating creation, which is what any builder needs to do. If I build stuff, right? So first I got to plan it, which is what God does when he says, Yehi this, let there be this. And then Vayas, God goes and makes it and does it. And then God's got to evaluate it and see what it looks like and whether it should stay or not. So Vayar Elohim Kitov, he sees that it was good, but if it was ever a Vayar Elohim Kira, that God saw it was bad, he'd have to get rid of it, like in the flood, by the way. Vayar Hashem ki rabba ra'ata adam. God saw that how bad mankind had become and eventually had to get rid of the world. It's God as judge, right? So the process of building is an impersonal process. If I create by building, I'm very objective. I got to make sure I build everything. I've got to put this over here and that over there. I've got to evaluate things afterwards. I have to be very judgmental and say this is good and this is bad, right? And so in world number 1, we are introduced to Elohim, the master builder, right? Who's looking at trying to create a structure of creation. He's trying to build a home, as it were, but he's not done once he's built that home, once he's built that structure. After that, there's a whole other layer of creation which can exist, which is Ela Toldot Shemaim Baretz Bihi Baram. B'yom Asot Hashem Elokim Eretz V'Shamayim. These are the generations of heaven and earth as they're being created. There's a different way of looking at God. And the different way of looking at God is as God as facilitator of organic union, right? What would it look like to see God as facilitator of organic union? God as a womb, right? So the story number 2 tells us, let's tell the entirety of the creation story from a different standpoint. And the subtlety of this is that the way that I just told it to you is a slight oversimplification. Because the way I just told it to you, it sounds like first there is creation story 1, and then there's creation story 2. First, God created all this structure, and then there's this organic world that builds upon that structure. The only thing is, that's not entirely true. Because if you look at the first verse in story number 2, what does it say? Eile toldot hashamayim va'aretz, these are the generations of heaven and earth. Behib aram, in the moment of their being created, as they are being created. Which means when does the organic aspect of creation begin? It begins simultaneously with the building aspect. As the building aspect is happening, the organic aspect is already beginning to happen. Both are running in tandem. Both creations are happening. Conceptually, you can see the building as creating a structure for the organic, but even as the structure is being created, the organic is starting, such that you can tell these 2 stories of creation that are happening simultaneously from 2 different perspectives. You can focus on the organic perspective, or you can focus on the building perspective. And as you do, you can talk about the same things that are happening. There's certain things that you could describe organically, or you can actually describe the same thing artificially as if it's a building thing.
Right.
You could see it both ways depending on what your prejudice is. And here maybe is where I'll leave you, Benji. What I would suggest is the following. Why? Why does the Torah do it this way? It's so complicated. Even if I agree, I say, yes, it's amazing. It's clear that these 2 texts are relating to each other. And it's clear that the 2 texts are relating to each other to show me these 2 aspects. And I begin to see it, and it's marvelous and it's wonderful. But why not make it more simple, right? Why not just give us one story? Why can't you just give us one story? The answer, I think, is that creation is one of the most mysterious of texts that we have. And it gets to the great mystery of
Maaseh Bereshit,
of how God created the world. One of the greatest mysteries. It gets to the essence of God, of who God is. It gets to the essence of creation. And inasmuch as that's so, it's inherently difficult to understand, to see how these 2 worlds work and connect with one another is very, very intricate and mind-blowing. Because that's true, the reality of it is, honestly, is that God is not Elohim, and God is not even Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. God is the merger of those 2 together. Because as we say in Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is our Elohim, Hashem Echad. God is really one.
Right.
The fact that we use different names to talk about God,
from our perspective,
is our perspective.
Right.
Because what biblical criticism looks at and says, oh, there's 2 authors.
Yes.
What our answer to that is, you know why there's 2 different names of God? Not because there's 2 authors, but because human beings have an easier time relating to God if they can categorize God the way they would categorize human traits.
Correct.
It's an illusion, but it's easier for us to think about it that way. When we think of God as compassionate, we can't think of the God of judgment. Those 2 things are like oil and water. They don't mix. Judgment and compassion in our worlds, that's father and mother. Those are 2 separate forces. We don't see that, right? The truth is that who is our master? Our master is the compassionate God. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. But in reality, human beings, we live in what I would call a fragmented world. What I mean by that is the truth of God is one. But the truth of this world is not one. The nature of this world is fragmented. There's nothing in this world that's one. All there is in this world are things that can be divided, right? I'm sitting at a table. The table is one table until I take an axe and divide it into two. Now it's two tables. A molecule is a molecule until I take it apart into its subatomic, into its parts. An atom is an atom until I crush it and take the electrons one place and the protons another place. We haven't met something that's small enough that I can't take it apart into two. Unity in our world is created through two things being in tension with one another. The nature of our world is a world of twos. It's not a world of ones. We've never met a simple oneness that we can't take apart yet. So we relate to things that way. In a deep kind of way, even the basic environment of our world, which modern physics has revealed to be space and time. Space and time, if you think about it, are the initial fragmenters of things that take something that's one and divide it up into parts. Because there's space, I have to be here in Woodmere, and you have to be there in Great Neck, and we're in two separate places because I can only occupy one space and you can only occupy another space. So space fragments us. Time also fragments us, right? Because I'm living right now in this little thing called the present. I can't live in the past, and I can't live in the future. But who's the reality of me? The reality of you, Benji, isn't just you at this particular moment of time. It's also all past Benjis, right? And the truth is, it's all future Benjis too. But you only get to live a little bit of your reality at this point, this little sliver in time, not all of your reality. But there is a God who's one, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh. Because if you think about time, existence in time in the past is Haya, was. Existence in time in the present is Hoveh, is. Existence in time in the future is Yihiyeh, will be. But there is no existence as Yud, He, and Vav, He existence. There's Haya, there's Hoveh, there's Yihiyeh, all of which sound a little bit like Yud, He, and Vav, He. But then there's a fourth kind of existence called Yud, He, Vav, He existence. But you know what that is? If you take Haya and you overlay it with Yihiyeh, and you overlay that with Hoveh, and you spell the word, it's Yud, He, and Vav, He, right? It is existence without reference to time. It's true oneness existence.
And Bereshit is the creation of time. It's actually all the factors that are needed. The scientists are discovering that are the needed to create the world, which is time, Shamayim is space, and Aretz is like matter. So all the building blocks of creation are there, and it's distinguishing. There is no dualism. Hashem is distinguishing himself from the world. He is transcendent.
Yes. And so what you have here, in a way, one way of seeing these two creation stories is how do we deal with the paradox of transcendence and immanence? How do we deal with the paradox of where God is? Is he there, beyond us, or is he here with us? The problem is God is a being from beyond time and space. He transcends time and space. He's the creator of time and space. He doesn't live in time and space. He's a oneness that doesn't really submit to the fragmentation of time and space. On the other hand, so he's got to play the game of fragmentation a little bit. You can't understand how a one being can get fragmented. Well, welcome to God in the world of time and space.
So I will suggest to the listeners to actually, I think you did a great video on this. I think it was your first video that you made on Parshat Tetzaveh, and you compared it to the symbolism of the Beit HaMikdash, and you explained Hashem's transcendence and you gave the whole Monopoly board.
Truma and Tetzaveh together. Yes, look at those two videos.
Those are great.
Yeah.
So actually, if I may, just to finish things off, you mentioned la'asot, and it actually reminded me of the whole story of Rabbi Akiva when he was challenged by a Roman officer, telling him what is greater, the creation of man or the creation of God? And Rabbi Akiva says the creation of man, and the officer was dumbfounded. How can you say that? I was expecting you to say that it would be God, and I had an answer for you. I would have said, that if God's creation is better, that means it's perfect. Then why do you do the Brit Milah? Right? Why do you do a circumcision? So he said, why did you answer, man? And Rabbi Akiva, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but he says that he, pointed out that with this pasuk, Asher bara Elokim la'asot, is that God created a world for us to take action, to do things. So meaning we'd say we take grapes and we turn it into wine. So we elevate it from ha'etz to Berei Pri HaGefen. It's an elevated bracha, and same with hamotzi, right? It requires a bracha rishona and achrona. And we elevate. Hashem gave us a world where we can elevate His creation. We are taking. So going back to finalizing all of this is, I think what I learned from what you just said is that even the creation of Adam, there's two creations of Adam, and the first creation of Adam is really like the template kind of, or you can even, if you want to say from an evolutionary standpoint, that it's talking about Adam meaning mankind, it's plural, and then later on it becomes Ha-Adam, a specific person, right? If you want to look at it that way. But from the perspective of, let's say, God, the creation of Adam, the blueprint of Adam, is the first account of creation, and the second account is really the toldot, right? It's the process of his becoming who he is. So,
or there's two ways to see. That's right. Or and here's the mystery of it. The mystery of it is in Bihi Baram, that somehow these two things are simultaneously, and it depends on your perspective. You can look at God as organic facilitator, or you can look at God as builder. And depending on and the truth is God is both. He's Hashem Elohim. How you look at God will depend on how you look at man that he's created. If I look at God as a builder, so first of all, who has the more intimate relationship with that which is created? A builder or a womb?
The womb.
The womb, right?
Yeah.
The builder is very impersonal. I build a table, but I don't love my table, right? So, right? But if a child emerges from my womb, I love my child. The whole notion of love, right, is a function of world number two. There's no love in world number one. All there is judgment, right? So notice, by the way, in world number one, look what the genders are called. Zacharu nekeva baram. See how antiseptic that is? Male and female, he created them.
Yes.
Look how the genders are described in world number two. Ish v'isha, right? Right? All of a sudden, there's that sense of love, man and woman, right? It's very different than male and female.
Yes.
If you look at man in world number one, he's the vice president of creation. He's Tselem Elohim. He has a mandate, the Kivshua, to conquer the world, to express in his own life the power that he sees in God. If God is the master and commander of creation, and I'm Tselem Elohim, so I am the master and commander, and I rule over the entire world, right? That's one vision of man. In world number two, man never gets that mandate. As a matter of fact, he's not in charge of creation. He's the servant of it. He's there la'avda u'lashamra, to serve, to guard over it. Instead of being on top of creation, creation is on top, and he's underneath. And both of these things are true. It's just a matter of perspective. The truth is in the mysterious interaction between creation story one and creation story two. And that's the great mystery of the early chapters in Genesis.
This was unbelievable. I mean, you've went above and beyond with your time, and I'm so grateful. And I'm sure Benzi, when he listens to the rest of this, he's gonna, love it. Thank you so much for taking the time out, and we just love you, and we hope to see you again, do this again. And I want to thank you again. So everybody who's listening, go to aleph-beta.org, sign up. It's for all ages. It's for everybody. It's really unbelievable. Thank you, Rabbi Fohrman.
Thank you very much. And the very best to you, and look forward to doing it again.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.